Councilmember Wozniak.
Yeah, I have a legal question, and then I want to make some comments about the discussion. So the legal question is we have an offer of a pro bono attorney taking on this case. Are we going to be indemnified against any losses if he would lose the case and there were attorney fees? What does being a pro bono attorney mean? I mean, you just don't pay him, but are there any exposures?
Well, that's what it means. You don't pay him. He'll do the legal work for free, but he is not in a position to pay any costs the city might have or any attorney's fees it might end up owing the other side if it were to lose.
So we couldn't require that he have an indemnity bond as part of the condition for representing us so the city would be made whole against any costs?
No. I mean, we can't require anything. What he's offered is what he's offered.
All right, so I want to make a couple of comments about the discussion. The first is, I think Dimitri Belcher showed a very interesting graph, and we've heard a lot of references that cell phones are causing brain cancer. And you can see in this that the usage of cell phones, the number of cell phones, has gone up dramatically in the last 2 decades. And yet the brain cancer rate per 100,000 people is not going up. It's constant. So there is contention and disagreement over these empirical studies. It's also very hard when you do empirical studies and you're trying to see weak effects to do the studies and match the populations. It gets particularly difficult now because essentially everybody uses a cell phone. There's no comparison population that people aren't using cell phones. So that's one of the problems. The second one is I want to come back to what one of the speakers mentioned is that, and I looked this up in the FCC guidelines, is it says that they do have a significant safety factor. They say the safety factor, and I'll read it, says our current RF exposure guidelines are example of such regulation, including a significant safety factor whereby the exposure limits are set at a level of the order of 50 times below the level at which adverse biological effects have been observed in laboratory animals. Okay, so we're arguing now, the FCC says they give guidelines to the cell phone manufacturers saying you have to meet exposure limits at 2% of what they think or what they have measurements from the laboratory that actually causes harmful effects, that they know are harmful effects. Now, other people argue that there are other things, but we're arguing, I mean, I think you have to look a little bit, are we getting lost in the trees and we're not looking at the forest? Okay, we're arguing about, if something is at 0 millimeters versus 5 millimeters or 10 millimeters, is this going to increase, have some significant exposure? And the FCC also says that. They say the reason they set the significant safety factor, the limits were set with a large safety factor to be well below the threshold for unacceptable rises in tissue temperatures. Result, exposure well above the SAR limit should not create any unsafe conditions. So they're saying we put in a big safety factor. They also, if you read the National Cancer Institute, there's a very good description of the opinions from a large number of studies, and they're saying there's tens of thousands of studies. Most of them don't show an effect. Some show an effect. People are trying to reproduce it, and it's an ongoing field of whether there's an effect or if it's weak or whether there's any effect at all. And everybody's monitoring it. Maybe in 10 years we'll know it for sure. But it's not a big effect. It's not like smoking, okay, and lung cancer. So I think we have to keep some perspective here, okay? Do we want to put a warning? And I think if you also look at the FCC, they say we don't think there are health effects, but if you want to reduce your exposure, you do these things. And there are some good suggestions. They say use a headset with Bluetooth, which reduces your exposure by another factor of like 50. It's on the order of 1 or 2% of what the cell phone when you have it close to your head. text, as someone said. There are things you can do that will actually reduce your exposure, and that information is out there. I disagree that it's not available. Maybe it is in large print, but when I look at my iPhone, it says that, and for RF exposures, it says during testing, iPhone radios are set to the highest transmission levels and placed in positions that simulate use against the head with no separation, which means right at, on the skull, and with 5 millimeter separation. Well, 5 millimeters, if you put it by your ear, that's 5 millimeters from your skull. 5 millimeters is 2/10 of an inch. It's pretty small. So they say they test them to meet the standards, which are set at 2% of the observable health effect limits in animal testing. That's what we do when we don't expose humans to things to try to see if you try it out on animals and you try to set your model and based on testing, you set it low because you want to have a safety factor, and you monitor it, continue to monitor it. I think this is a misguided effort, and I don't think it really it's accurate in what it says, Councilman Anderson, so I'm not going to support it.
You let CTI answer questions. Let's let Joel.
Look, sir, you're out of order. You're out of order.
We'll keep talking.
Okay.
You have
So-
me next?
Councilman Mayo?
Well, I wanted to hear more discussion, but because I actually think I've been reading this, particularly this letter from Lisa Bailey, where she says there's been no research really on this topic. And I know some may say there's no evidence that cell phones may cause breast cancer. However, there has not been any scientific study showing that there is no harm. So it goes back to the precautionary principle again. I'd like to be able to come together with some language that doesn't refer to people's lingerie or clothing, that basically just talks about not carrying the cell phone next to the body, which is almost your language, when it's turned on and connected to a wireless network, which is what we heard about, and to refer to the instructions in your cell phone or user manual for the recommended separation distance, which is in Councilmember Anderson's item. I don't think there's any harm after that in actually proposing some of the things that you might want to advise people to do. But I do like the clarity of that language that I just read, so that there's not any confusion. I mean, one of the things they seem to do, which we hear now, every time we hear this language, is it's very confusing. You can't pin it right down. It's the squirmy language. It puts in words and it jumbles them together so that you really can't follow the train of thought. Now, that's subterfuge, and we've seen it so many times in so many different places. Just read your credit card statement if you can. The terms and conditions, they're exactly like that. So I'm really anxious to hear what some of my other council members have to say. Thank you.
Okay, Councilman Erickson?
I agree with the general direction that Councilmember Mayo is suggesting. I think what she's saying is, I think, in keeping with what Councilman Anderson is proposing, presenting language that really meets the mandated disclosure that's required, and provides, I think, important and useful information to a purchaser. So I agree that saying something to the effect of, the closer the device is to you, the more more energy you absorb. I think that makes sense. I do think the suggestion that Councilmember Anderson had included in his language about referring to the instructions in your phone or user manual for the recommended separation distance, and I will also add the separation absorption limit. Because it's not just the disclosure just doesn't talk about the separation distance, it talks about the SAR for the device.
How many people know that? How about that?
Well, I just looked at my disclosure, which I didn't even know about actually until I read this item, that my iPhone, you have to go, click on the settings app and then go to about and then go to legal. It's not very easy to access that information, but my understanding what the FCC disclosure does is this is the SAR limit for this device, this is the recommended separation distance, and these are some things that you should do to minimize exposure, such as a wireless headset or any other, hands-free device. So I think what Councilor Mayo is suggesting, I think, is, in keeping with what Councilor Anderson is trying to accomplish, and I think provides useful information that is consistent with the mandated disclosure. So I want to strongly encourage the mover and the seconder to consider that.
Yeah. Maybe I can talk now. I think that what Councilmember Anderson has put forward is, is quite bold, and I find some difficulty with the language, particularly about the clothing. And what I also wondering, and also what Councilmember Mayo is putting forward is clear, and it's probably, accurate. So I really think we need to work on some more language, frankly. I think we need to work on some more language. And I would much rather it was preventative myself, rather than trying to worry. I'd rather saying, look, if there's concerns about this, these are some steps you ought to take if you're concerned, And so I would like to do it more in a positive nature. And so I would request that I'll offer a substitute motion that we put this over to
We have a suggestion.
If
If you'd like to refer the totality of the language that you've been talking about to the city attorney, he is in communication with Professor Lessig, and perhaps the two of them could discuss all of this and come back with something that Professor Lessig might have some thoughts about as well.
Request that we refer it to the city attorney to consult with Professor Leslie, is that what his name? Okay. And that you come back with language that is more positive in nature about what preventative things you can take in order to overcome this. So it's not a negative thing, but it's a more positive thing. And so I would make that a substitute motion. Second. And I think this issue is important. I think it's vital, and I thank Councilmember Anderson for sticking with it, because I think we're going to come up with something that we're going to like. Well, Councilmember Anderson is actually next. Okay.
Well, let me just say this. I think this issue is of such importance that it's easy to get diverted. Now, I listened to Councilmember Wozniak's comments. He seemed to be referring to another item. This wasn't the item that's before him, because none of it talks about what he talked about, disease rates and all that stuff. We're talking about lifting the language that the FCC has imposed on the manufacturers and making it legible and understandable to people. We didn't talk about diseases in the language or anything like that. Yeah. That would have been a killer to the language. You know that, I know that. So it's not in there. And, you're much more worthy of a better swan song than this. To distort what I put before you and worked several years on to protect the public by giving them the language that they would need to make informed decisions. And that's all this is. All the rest of the editorializing and stuff is not in this language. It's not in this ordinance. It merely amplifies the language that the FCC says you need to know about making the decision. It doesn't give a bunch of statistics on tumors and what kind, where they arise from, who has them. Has nothing in there like that. But the bulk of that argument was against that, which is kind of a red herring. We want to inform the public. We think they need to know. We think our life experiences about the drive for money and profits sometimes shortchanges the truth when it comes to providing consumers with useful information. And I'll stand by that.
Thank you. Thank you. Councilmember Worthington. Councilmember Worthington.
Thank you. Well, I think it's unfortunate to have a substitute motion before we actually explore whether or not it's possible to get unanimous agreement. And I understand the sentiments that Councilmember Mayo and Councilmember Ergin are suggesting in terms of modifications to the language, but I guess to me what we have before us is we have language that was put together by an attorney who spent a lot of time thinking about this and who seems to have some expertise on the subject. And so for me to just throw out my language, based on my, my personal opinions, doesn't really seem all that helpful. And I don't. I think this is, as one of our speakers earlier this morning, earlier this evening, it seems like it was this morning, commented, we are in the 21st century. And in the 21st century, I don't think talking about a pants or a shirt pocket or even that scandalous language tucked into a bra, I don't think anybody, no matter what their religious sensitivities or cultural sensitivities, in modern America, I don't think anybody's offended or scandalized by such language. This is governmental, bureaucratic language. This is not some, scandalous Pulp Fiction. This is bureaucratic expertise came up with this. So, I guess what I'm interested in is, can we come up, instead of having a competing motion, because I think Councilmember Anderson's motion should win based on the immense amount of expertise and hard work that he's put into it, but I'm not unsympathetic to considering these other ideas that are being thrown out. So I guess I wanted to see, is there a way that we can come up with language that doesn't require a substitute motion? I think that's insulting to Councilmember Anderson's work to throw out a substitute at this time when we haven't even heard from Councilmember Anderson as to what potential amendments would work to get the basic essence of what he's worked on to move forward. So I guess I'd like us to have the courtesy of listening to Councilmember Anderson of what possible amendments to his motion might allow us to move forward with that.
Well, we're happy to put him on the queue, but he's spoken at least 3 times. He's spoken for at least 20 minutes.
Right,
So-
but I guess my
it's not like we don't know where he's coming from.
well, no, my
Councilman-
question, my question, if through the chair, am I allowed to ask a question of Councilmember Anderson?
Sure.
'Cause,
Why don't we do it after we hear from Eric?
I strongly support your original motion, but obviously there's people proposing modifications. So is there a way to amend your motion so that it can win? Or do you want us to just stick with your motion and...
Not tonight.
Because the way it is now...
Okay,
the way it is now, if I want to vote for Anderson's motion, I have to vote against the substitute,
right.
and then we have a divided vote.
That's right.
Can't we actually work together and come up with language
Mr.
that we
Worthington,
can agree on?
Mr. Worthington, I believe it's very clear that Mr. Councilman Wozniak is not supporting this and won't support it, so you're never going to get a unanimous. Councilmember Ergin, you're...
So I may have a potential solution. So I'd like to offer a friendly amendment to the maker of the main motion that the motion would be framed as to direct staff to refer to the city manager the creation of an ordinance, and that we would be referring both the language that you have put forward, Councilmember, as well as the language that Councilmember Mayo put forward. And my understanding is that there'll be some conversation between the city attorney's office and Professor Lessig on developing language. That ensures at least that both sets of language are considered in the drafting of the ordinance, and hopefully that can help build consensus around taking an action. So I'd like to offer that as a friendly amendment.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, As a maker of
I accept that.
In the substitute, I want to move with the substitute, because I don't object to that, but I think I want to put it in a positive vein. I don't want to put it in a negative vein. I want to put it in what you can, I want to put it in the vein that when we go forward with the language, what you can do to prevent this from occurring. And it might be, you know, you say that you got to move it away from your body, but I want to say headsets, I want to put this other stuff in there. So, Councilman Ringroth?
Yeah, thank you.
So you're not recognized, have a seat. We're not going to take public testimony. Councilman?
Yes. Regardless of whether or not there's science to prove any of this, I'm very much in favor of the consumer's right to know. And, but I do have a problem with the wording, and that's because I think that the consumer will say, okay, I'm not going to put it in my bra, I'm not going to put it in my pants pocket.
I'm going to put it someplace.
I'm going to put it someplace else.
On my neck.
I'm going to hang it on my neck, I'm going to, you know, put it in my hat. In other words, it's too specific in its recommendation. And so while I was sitting here listening to everybody, I have drafted something that might be more acceptable. And that is, in order to prevent the possible exposure to radio frequency energy that may exceed federal exposure guidelines, avoid using and carrying a phone directly against the body when turned on and connected to a wireless network.
I think we should go with having our lawyers. Yes,
Well, I'm happy to give this to the attorney.
I would suggest that one of the issues, and perhaps one of the lesser issues in drafting this ordinance, is the kind of, you know, the tone and the positive versus negative, and exactly how you put it.
Right.
Probably the more important issue that Professor Lessig and I are going to be worrying about is staying close enough to governmental published documents, even if they're not as mellifluous as we might like. And so I would suggest that we get where you want to be as positive as possible, and at the same time we want to make it as ironclad as possible. So I don't know that drafting it right now is a good use of time.
That's what my motion is, actually. That's what the intent of the motion is to.
But I would like, wait, I'm not finished.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I would like, whatever it is that we look at, I think that people need some constructive suggestions for how to mitigate this possible problem. And, you know, women's clothing doesn't usually have pockets, so it's not designed that way. Men usually keep their cell phones in their pockets, but where are women supposed to keep their cell phones?
We keep them in our purses. We do.
We keep them in our purses. Our purses, however, are next to our hips. So I just think we need some positive and constructive suggestions for how to handle this.
Okay, Councilmember Mayo, and then we're going to go to
So
vote.
I'm going to support sending all of these comments that we made tonight through the city manager so that they can confer with Professor Lessig, who you want us to confer with. You want us to be on solid ground as we move forward. So I think that's the smartest thing for us to do, although we might want to go ahead very quickly. This is really the smartest thing that we can do. Given that there's a challenge possibly looming, we'd be in the best possible position. So I'm going to support the mayor's substitute motion, and I hope we can actually come to just a main motion here with the main motion maker and the seconder.
Well, if the main motioner wants to accept that,
But I mean, we would just forward our concerns and our to the manager.
No, the motion I made was I want it to be as positive as possible. I don't want the negative aspects.
Yes, but can we not?
No, well, I'm happy to send everything
Good.
to all this
That's
stuff
all I care about.
As long as it's in a comes back in the positive as possible way to say it. Okay, Councilmember Worthington, we're ready to vote.
They'll be back soon.
I think the substitute motion is doing exactly the opposite of what the city attorney just told us that we shouldn't be doing. And that's part of why I think the main motion is a better motion.
Okay.
Because the substitute motion says focus on, I mean, I love the song, Accentuate the Positive, Eliminate the Negative.
That's right.
It's a beautiful song, it's a beautiful sentiment. But we're working in the real world, and so we should actually be dealing with what the lawyers, we have language that a reputable, nationally renowned lawyer has proposed. We have advice from our city attorney, which is, you know, that the issue of the positive or negative is really not the relevant thing. So I think you know, I think the original motion is much more intelligent and much more effective. Thank you.
I'd like to hear the motion, the substitute motion, the main motion, and the substitute.
So what? Hold on. Councilor Erging, if you want to speak.
So I'd like to offer one more friendly amendment in the hopes. Well, no, I mean, I think it's out of respect to Councilman Anderson, who's been working on this. I don't think we're that far apart. I think it's possible for us to come to agreement.
Just respect me. Respect the realities
Yeah.
of the public are facing.
No, I mean, and I think we're pretty close to coming to consensus. So what Councilmember Mayo had said is that we forward the language that was introduced, the language that she has submitted as a supplemental item, and the comments that have been put forward by the council as part of the referral to the city manager to consult with Professor Lessig to develop an ordinance. So I'd like to offer that as a friendly amendment to just clarify that that's what the action we'd be taking in the main motion, if that's acceptable to you.
Okay, so Councilor
That's the
Mayo?
question. I would like to know what the difference is between the two also. What do you have,
I think it would
I'm
be
asking
better-
the clerk what you have
Oh, no,
as this.
excuse me, time out.
Yes.
I want to ask the manager, because the
Okay.
manager was the one to help with, what do you have for the motion? Or what you think the motion is?
To refer to
No,
the language.
the substitute.
The substitute.
The mayor is asking me to clarify the substitute motion which he made, which was to refer to the city attorney and Professor Lessig language that is more positive in nature, taking into consideration the language proposed by Councilmember Anderson and the language proposed by Councilmember Mayo.
That's right. That's the motion. That's the motion. That's the substitute.
The main motion is the item that's submitted, and I don't know if you accepted Councilmember Aragin's friendly amendment. I believe you did. So that was to include also the language proposed by Councilmember Mayo.
I think that this motion, the substitute motion, needs to travel with the understanding that we want the most defensible, the most strongest position we can be in when the language comes back. And I think that's your intent, is it not?
Yeah, that's my intent.
Well, I think we want the most effective language. I mean, we're trying to address a problem.
Well, I think
The
that
problem is that the language that's in the manuals and in the phones is obscure and it's not clear. We want the language clear, that holding this phone, carrying it too close to your body in violation of the FCC guidelines poses risk to you. The FCC has said that.
Well, Max, let's don't re-debate it. We already know the facts. So, Councilmember Capitelli, and then I want to go to a vote.
Well, I would just like to go back to Councilmember Anderson's motion, which basically gives some proposed wording, but it's not exact, and referring to the creation of an ordinance. And I would like to add that is most effective and defensible language.
There you go.
And so the proposed wording is proposed wording. I would also, I would like to make some suggestions, which I'll be happy to pass along to the city attorney as to some additional language or changes that might be made. So taking into account, I think Councilmember Anderson's motion takes into account all the suggestions, including Councilmember Miles and Aragin's, that have been made on the dais. So
We don't see much of a difference.
yeah, so I would, my inclination would be that the city attorney's heard us. We don't really need this substitute motion. I think we could just go to the main motion.
With an understanding the positive notion.
The main motion has things in it that are objectionable. They're objectionable.
Well,
so, I'm sorry. So,
But those have been noted by the city attorney.
I know, but then, what is he supposed to do? Throw them out? If it's passed, then it's passed. So you can't pass something that you don't want him to take into consideration. We're going to go to Worthington and then more, and then we're going to vote.
Well, I guess I haven't gotten a sense. I mean, I think the substitute motion is hardly seems like a motion, given that it's not too different from the main motion, but the casting aspersions that there are things in the main motion that are objectionable. What are the things in the main motion that are objectionable?
All the stuff about the clothing and all of that.
So,
Yeah.
so those words that came from a government document are objectionable.
They're objectionable. They're objectionable. Remember more.
That's, I think, I think.
Councilmember Moore, while he's thinking. Councilmember Moore.
No, I'm going to be very brief. I'm just going to say I want to respect the hard work and diligence. I mean, this has been before the council for over a year that Councilmember Anderson has put into this item. I don't see much distinction between the two. I'm going to support the main motion.
Okay, call the roll. Call the roll on the substitute motion.
On the substitute motion, Councilmember Mayo?
Yes.
Moore? Anderson? Arreguín? Capitelli? Wengraf? Worthington?
No.
Wozniak?
Abstain.
Mayor Bates?
Yes.
Let's go to the main motion.
And on the main motion, Councilmember Mayo?
Yes.
Moore?
Yes.
Anderson?
Yes.
Arreguín?
Yes.
Capitelli?
Yes.
Wengraf? Worthington?
Yes.
Wozniak?
No.
Mayor Bates?
No.
Motion passes.
Thank you all. See you next time. What else do we have going on?
Okay, we now have item number 39.
I mean, a distinction without a difference.
Oh, yeah.
Well, then.
This is a
Oh, yeah.
Right.
five-year plan for the,
Oh, the poor staff is in the back.